Teen dramas are nothing new. For years, shows like Gossip Girl, Skins, and 13 Reasons Why tried to capture the darker side of teenage life. Some did it more successfully than the others. Euphoria did it differently, or more controversially. The story centers around Rue, a teenage girl struggling with addiction due to her mental illness and the death of her father. Through her narration, we get an inside look into the lives of the people around her, their relationships, insecurities, and destructive behaviors. Each episode is constructed so it has an A plot and a B plot. The A plot revolves around the main character the episode focuses on, while the B plot follows other characters and events in their lives that intertwine with the A plot. This is how we meet Jules, Nate, Maddy, Cassie, Kat, and others. But more importantly, we see them through Rue's perspective. And Rue is by no means a reliable narrator. She's cynical and often lost in her own struggles, not to mention high most of the time. Her addiction shapes the way she sees the world, making the storytelling feel distorted at times, as if you're watching a reality through a cracked mirror. This narrative style gives the show a unique identity. It isn't trying to present a clean or educational message about teenage life. Instead, it leans fully into chaos. But the real secret to Euphoria's success isn't just the writing, it's the style. Even before watching the show, I was aware of its aesthetics. If you were on TikTok around 2019 or 2020, you couldn't escape Euphoria. The show's visual style became a full-blown cultural trend. Suddenly, everyone was recreating the glittery makeup looks designed by the incredible artist Donny Davy. Neon lighting and moody, high-contrast visuals became a shorthand for emotional intensity and personal drama. Slow-motion edits of the characters paired with dramatic music flooded social media feeds. Entire scenes from the show were transformed into viral TikTok sounds. Songs from the soundtrack, especially those by Labyrinth, were repurposed as emotional backdrops for millions of short videos. Fans created edits featuring characters like Rue, Jules, and Cassie, adding dreamy filters, neon tints, and slow-motion effects that mirrored the show's cinematography. Even the way the show was filmed, its surreal sequences, extreme close-ups, and stylized lighting shaped how creators began editing videos online, influencing a generation's approach to storytelling on social media. Strangely, Euphoria became less of a traditional TV show and more of a cultural mood or vibe. Its influence extended beyond the screen. Fashion brands incorporated glitter, bold eyeliner, and dramatic eye makeup into mainstream campaigns. Music playlists adopted the show's mix of pop, hip-hop, and atmospheric tracks, and the aesthetic language of emotional intensity, glitz, glamour, and chaos spread across digital culture. But while the aesthetics was everywhere, the actual story was much more complicated. The show's dark themes, addiction, trauma, manipulation, and identity struggles coexisted with the glamorous visuals, creating a tension that made it both aspirational and disturbing. On TikTok and beyond, people often celebrated the look and style of Euphoria without always engaging with the messy, often unsettling realities the show was portraying. The majority of the main characters in Euphoria are unlikable, and their only redeemable trait is their trauma. They're drowning in their own problems, which constantly spill over into the lives of others. They hurt each other, manipulate each other, and make terrible decisions, but that chaos is also what makes the show work. The main character, Rue, is defined by her addiction. She is shaped almost entirely by it, and she's not a good person. You can feel for her, but she constantly lies, manipulates, and hurts those who love her. Her addiction destroys her life and deeply affects those around her, especially her younger sister, Gia. Gia is one of the most overlooked characters, yet she arguably carries the heaviest emotional burden of Rue's addiction. While their mother focuses on keeping Rue alive and sober, Gia is often pushed aside, forced to witness the constant emotional arguments between her sister and their mother. She is also the one who finds Rue after which is an incredibly traumatic experience for someone so young. Moments like these show the real cost of addiction, not just for the person suffering, but for those who love them. As the series progresses, especially in season 2, we are given more reasons to sympathize with Rue, but also more reasons to question her behavior. Her relationship with Jules becomes the emotional center of the show. For Rue, Jules represents hope, escape, and a brief reason to stay sober. But this dynamic places an unfair burden on Jules, who ends up caring much much of the emotional weight of Rue's recovery. Jules struggles with her own identity and sense of belonging. She arrives seeking freedom and self-expression, but quickly becomes entangled in the same chaos as everyone else. Her relationship with Rue constantly shifts as both struggle to understand what they need from each other. Jules also becomes entangled in a dangerous situation with Cal Jacobs, later revealed as Nate Jacobs' father, which Nate then exploits to manipulate her. Nate is terrifying and surprisingly well written. He is defined by control, repression, and the toxic environment created by his father. Growing up in a world of secrecy and manipulation leaves him with a warped understanding of relationships and power. His cruelty is calculated, especially towards Jules and Maddy. Nate's trauma drives an obsession with protecting his family and himself from humiliation, while his anger often seems aimed at not just his father, but at the world itself. In season 1, Nate's relationship with Maddy is often portrayed as one of the show's most volatile. Maddy projects confidence, but much of her identity is tied to the intensity of their bond, which swings between affection and destruction. In season 2, the love triangle between Nate, Maddy, and Cassie takes center stage. Cassie is deeply damaged, centering her life on male validation and struggling to confront her family trauma. After season 1, Nate exploits her vulnerability, leading her to completely reshape herself to keep his attention, even dressing like Maddy in hopes of being loved. Together, these characters form a tangled web of relationships. What makes them captivating isn't just the drama, but how each character's trauma shapes their interactions. Addiction, insecurity, abandonment, and repression collide, creating a world where nearly every relationship is strained by unresolved pain. And if there's one moment that perfectly captures the chaos of their lives, it is Lexi's school play. Lexi's play quickly became one of the most iconic moments in the show. Even people who had never seen the show knew about it. Before I started watching the series myself a few weeks ago, it was one of the few things I was already familiar with. At first, the play feels like a strange narrative detour. Suddenly, the story pauses so that Lexi can stage an entire theatrical production about the lives of people around her. But the more you think about it, the more it starts to feel like a reflection of how the show has been telling its story all along. For most of the series, the audience experiences events through the perspective of Rue. She narrates the lives of people around her, explains their histories, and frames the way we understand the world of the show. But Rue also openly admits that she isn't always a reliable narrator. Her addiction, her emotions, and her relationships inevitably shape the way the story is presented. Lexi's play introduces a second storyteller. Unlike Rue, Lexi spends most of the series observing rather than participating. She watches her friends spiral, fight, fall in love, and self-destruct, usually from the sidelines. The play perfectly blends with performance. The audience sees actors on stage recreating moments from the characters' lives, while the real characters sit in the crowd watching themselves being portrayed. The camera constantly cuts between the stage and their reactions. This creates a layered narrative where the characters are forced to confront how their actions look from the outside. But the play also serves another purpose, because Lexi is recreating moments from their real lives. Some of the events we previously experienced only through Rue's narration suddenly appear from a different perspective. In that sense, the play confirms that many of the things Rue described actually did happen, and they weren't just a figment of Rue's imagination. For a brief moment, the story steps outside of Rue's perspective, and the world of Euphoria looks very different from the outside. Euphoria was never a light show. It dealt with addiction, toxic relationships, and deeply damaged characters. But in the first season, much of that darkness was filtered through a highly stylized aesthetics. Rue's addiction, for example, was often shown through glittery lighting, dreamy cinematography, and sequences that resembled music videos. Getting high was framed in a way that felt strangely beautiful. The show leaned heavily into spectacle, neon lights, slow-motion parties, and emotional narration that gave the story a surreal quality. Of course, terrible things were already happening in season 1, like everything Nate ever did. Cassie's and McKay's assault at college are deeply disturbing moments, but most of the time they're used to show how damaged the characters are at some surface level, and they just choose not to fully explore their trauma. McKay's assault, for example, is barely addressed from his perspective, with the story focusing more on how it affects Cassie. In season 2, the show removes much of its stylistic distance and forces the audience to confront the consequences of the characters' actions more directly. The aesthetics is still there, but the story becomes far harsher. Rue's addiction is presented to us more realistically. Her relapse becomes chaotic, violent, and deeply uncomfortable to watch. Instead of glitter and dreamlike sequences, the show focuses on the damage addiction causes, the screaming fights with her family, the destruction of her home, and the emotional wreckage left behind. Other storylines grow darker as well. Nate graduates from Maddy to threatening her with a gun. Cassie spirals into a relationship that completely reshapes her identity, and Fesco's world, somewhat separate from high school drama of other characters, becomes darker and ultimately ends in tragedy with Ashtray's death. By the end of second season, the tone of Euphoria feels fundamentally different from where it started. The stylized beauty that once softened the show's darkest themes begin to fade, leaving something far harsher behind. The first trailer shows that the upcoming season of Euphoria appears to be taking one of the biggest risks a character-driven show can take, a significant time jump. Early footage and the new trailer suggest that the story moves several years forward, pushing the characters out of high school and into early adulthood. What once looked like an intimate drama about messy teenage lives now seems like the characters have wandered into the world that feels more Grand Theft Auto 5 than a suburban coming-of-age story filled with substance abuse. But considering that season 2 introduced a very dangerous arc for Rue with Lauren and the show completely abandoned it, it was expected for it to be central to Rue's character in season 3. The question is whether Rue will still be a narrator and how that will be managed if the characters are separated from one another and not as present in each other's lives as they used to be. The time jump is also complicated by real-world events behind the scenes. The death of Angus Cloud, who played Fesco, leaves a major narrative gap. Fesco was deeply tied to multiple characters, especially Rue and Lexi, so the show will have to acknowledge his absence in a way that feels respectful while still moving the story forward. A time jump could provide a natural way to address the loss, but it also risks feeling too distant if not handled carefully. Also, some of the actors have become huge public figures since then, and in a few cases, their public image has taken some, let's say, unexpected directions. It's one of those situations where you try to separate the character from the person playing them, but it does change how some scenes feel in retrospect. I do wonder if things like this will affect the show and how we perceive the characters. Historically, time jumps can revitalize a story or completely disrupt its momentum. When they work, it's because the time jump reflects real character growth rather than simply resetting the narrative. The danger of Euphoria is that the series was never just about the plot, it was about a specific moment in life. If the show moves too far away from that moment, it may feel like an entirely different story. At the same time, that might be exactly the point. If the characters have truly grown up, the chaos of their teenage years shouldn't look the same anymore. The real challenge for the next season isn't just explaining the time jump, it's proving that Euphoria can still understand these characters once they're no longer teenagers. One thing that becomes very noticeable while watching Euphoria today is how much of the show's identity is built around being edgy. The series constantly pushes boundaries with explicit content, shocking storylines, and intense emotional moments, but sometimes that edge comes across as style over substance. A lot of show's most controversial moments are presented through a very glamorous lens. The lighting, the music, the slow motion shots, and the aestheticized cinematography give even the darkest moments a kind of beauty. That visual style is one of the reasons the show became so culturally influential, but it also creates a strange effect where certain behaviors start to feel normalized, even when they probably shouldn't be. Kat's camgirl storyline really stands out in a conversation like this. Kat begins selling explicit content online while hiding behind a mask, and the show literally frames this as a story of empowerment. She becomes more confident, more assertive, and more comfortable with herself. The message seems to suggest that as long as it makes her feel empowered, selling her body online is perfectly acceptable. The show also plays with another familiar trope using Kat's character, the idea that girls are attracted to bad boys. Kat ends up dating one of the nicest and most supportive characters in the series, yet she quickly grows bored with him and ultimately breaks up with him because she finds him unexciting. Addiction is portrayed through a similar duality. Through Rue, we see addiction at its most destructive, but at the same time, characters like Elliot show a different version of addiction, one where a person can seemingly function while still abusing using drugs. Watching the show now, I can't help but wonder how differently I would have perceived all of this if I had watched it when it originally aired. Back then, I was much younger, and my understanding of these themes would probably have been very different. When you're closer in age to the characters, it's easier to see their behavior as rebellious, exciting, or even aspirational. The parties, the drugs, the messy relationships, all of it can feel like a part of a dramatic coming-of-age story. But watching it now with more distance, it's easier to recognize how destructive many of these situations actually are. Instead of feeling edgy or glamorous, a lot of characters' decisions feel exhausting, self-destructive, and sometimes even tragic. That shift in perspective makes it easier to question the way the show frames certain behaviors and to notice the contradictions between what the story seems to criticize and what it sometimes unintentionally glamorizes. At the same time, the world itself has changed significantly since Euphoria first dominated the cultural zeitgeist. The late 2010s had a very different cultural atmosphere compared to the early 2020s. After years marked by global disruption, social shifts, and a much broader conversation about mental health and online culture, some of the show's themes now land differently. Issues like addiction, online sexuality, and digital identity are discussed more openly and more critically than they were just a few years ago. Because of that, certain storylines in the show can feel less shocking and more complicated when viewed today. What once might have felt provocative or groundbreaking can now feel like a snapshot of a particular cultural moment, one that looks slightly different when revisited from the present. Thank you so much to everyone who took time to watch this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit like and subscribe. I really appreciate your support, and I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment letting me know which TV show or movie you'd like me to cover next.